first time this has happened to me that I'm prepared a nice script and then I stand on the stage and the lights are so bright that I can't actually read it. So, welcome to Lancaster University's public lecture series. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome so many of you this evening for this. My name's Edward Simpson and I'm the Executive Dean of Arts and Humanities at the university. And it gives me a great pleasure this evening to welcome Professor Joe Moran from Liverpool John Moores University. Joe is a professor of cultural and literary history and has been interested in things which are mundane but then reveal beauty and surprise. Things such as queuing, roads, the motorway network, and what we do on our sofas while we watch television. Joe also has a stand-up routine about shyness. Joe has written for many leading UK publications, including The Guardian and many others. And I'm particularly pleased to welcome him this evening because he's talking about two topics close to my heart, and I hope topics close to your heart as well. What is the role of the university as we approach the mid-21st century? Education has changed, the world around us has changed. What role do universities have in contemporary society? And I hope along the way, Joe will also reveal something through the story of his own family about Lancaster University and its origins. We will have time for Q&A at the end, and I hope you'll all join us for a drink afterwards at the back of this room. So please join me to give a very warm welcome to Joe for this Lancaster University's public lecture. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you to Ed for introducing me. Thank you to Lancaster for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. It's really nice to see a full room on a cold February evening. I want to talk to you about what a university is, what it's for. I'll try not to be too depressing, but I can't promise anything. But I want to start by looking back almost 60 years when the University of Lancaster opened. There were only 296 undergraduates who enrolled in that first year. And my parents, my late father, and my mother, who's actually in the audience tonight, she's on the front row, were two of those students. They were both lucky because they left school in 1964 when universities like Lancaster were opening to keep pace with what they called the bulge, which was basically the baby boom. The baby boomers were coming of age around the early to mid-60s. And also what they called the trend, which is the tendency for more young people to want to go to university, to stay on in education. And that trend has carried on more or less steadily ever since. My dad was from an Irish working class family. He arrived in Smethwick, near Birmingham, from West Clare, age 13, and he was put straight in a secondary modern school, which was what they did to working class Irish immigrant school children then. And he left that school with 2 O-levels. He still got into sixth form at a grammar school at the recommendation of his secondary modern headmaster, but it wasn't a very good grammar school, and he basically taught himself at Smethwick Library. My mum was the son of a miner in the Lancashire goldfields, and he'd actually been killed in a mining accident, and her mother had died the year earlier, so my mother was an orphan at 13, and she spent a lot of time looking after her much younger brothers. So not very surprisingly, neither of my parents had very much idea of what university meant or how to go about getting into one. My mum was in a convent school, a grammar school in Wigan, having passed her 11 plus. But her experience was quite typical in that grammar schools, which now tend to be idealised as engines of social mobility, grammar schools at this time were generally not much help to bright working class pupils, especially girls. University applications were largely left to the pupils themselves and their parents, which obviously favoured middle class children. One of the things that put university on the radar for my mother was the University Challenge, which began in September 1962, just as she was entering the sixth form. That is the Lancaster team from, I think, 1965. And she used to watch it after she'd put her much younger brothers to bed. And that was when she got her first glimpse of these slightly exotic, usually besuited, usually male beings that she hadn't seen before, because students were, at the time, about 5% of the age group. Now, my dad's council flat in Smethwick had no television, so he hadn't even seen University Challenge. He had formed the ambition to go to university while walking through the campus of Birmingham University, which was near his sixth form in Edgbaston, partly because he really liked the look of the refectory. And that is the refectory. And when I heard that story, I thought, that's a strange reason to want to go to university. But it's actually quite a nice refectory. It was designed by the modernist architect Hugh Casson. And actually, I do think it's quite important if you're not used to a social space like a university. It was okay for me. I was the son of an academic, so I sort of knew what university was. I'd been to a university. I knew what the lecture theatres and seminar rooms looked like. If you're a first-generation student, it's quite important to be able to picture yourself in that social space and to feel comfortable in it. So yeah, he saw the refectory and he thought, I'd like to go to university. The problem was that Birmingham, like most other universities, required at least 5 O-levels, and he only had 2. He discovered, rummaging in the school store cupboard where the university prospectuses went to die, because his grammar school, like my mum's, was quite indifferent to his ambitions, there was this small group of new universities that was just opening. And he wondered if they perhaps did not impose such strict entry requirements. So he applied to the 2 universities that were due to admit their first students in 1964. One of them was Essex, which turned him down, and the other one was Lancaster, which put him on a waiting list, and he discovered later on that it put almost everyone on a waiting list. Both my parents were also lucky because Lancaster was due to open a year ahead of schedule. So its prospectus was sent out too late for applicants to go through the university's central clearinghouse, which is now called UCAS and was then called UCA. So Lancaster had no interviews. This was just as well for my mum, because her personal statement on her UCA form was largely a work of fiction. It said that she liked horse riding, she'd never been on a horse, that she loved the music of Edvard Grieg, which she'd never heard, and the poetry of T.S. Eliot, which she, I don't think, had read. And if she had gone for interview, those fictions would have been exposed. Lancaster had no entry tariffs. It was prepared to look twice at applicants like my dad with his 2 O-levels and my mum, who had failed her maths O-level 3 times before being advised by the nuns to give up. So they arrived in Morecambe, where their digs were. I think everyone's digs were in Morecambe. On the same day, all the students arrived on the same day, which was Tuesday, the 6th of October, 1964. And for almost all the the new students, because there were no interviews, this would have been the first time that they set foot in Morecambe or Lancaster. My dad's idea of being a student, came largely from reading Brideshead Revisited. That is the 1962 Penguin edition with the Quentin Blake cover that my dad had, and I now have his copy with his name inside. On the strength of that book, he'd bought a Paisley dressing gown because he thought that was what being a student involved, sort of sitting around until noon dressed in your dressing gown. It was inside his suitcase, which was cardboard, and of course he soon realised it wasn't really what was required, and I'm not sure he ever wore it. And he got off at Morecambe Promenade railway station, which no longer exists, and there was an Indian summer that autumn, and the tourist season was just dying down. Morecambe was then near the end of its glory years as a seaside resort before package holidays and foreign holidays came in. That's Morecambe in 1964. And he had a longish walk down the prom to his digs on the east side of town. It never occurred to him to get a taxi because he'd never been in a taxi. And he arrived at dusk, and the illuminations were just coming on, and you could see the sort of Lakeland Fells across the bay. And bear in mind, he'd only really been in two places. He'd come from Smethwick, with its blackened buildings and derelict canals, and the west of Ireland in the late 50s was a very poor place, and he just thought, I've arrived. I've arrived in paradise. The campus at Bailrigg wasn't built yet, and it wouldn't properly open until 1966. So the main university building was an old furniture factory in the town centre in St Leonard's Gate. That is now private student accommodation. I'm not sure if the students know that they're living in the old main building. And the Grand Theatre across the road was rented out for lectures. There was the Congregational Church at the corner of St Leonard's Gate was the main sort of common room. So it was very small. Lancaster in 1964 was smaller in both its footprint and its number of students than a typical secondary school. Obviously, it got very much bigger quite quickly. But because of these very small and makeshift beginnings, this was a very exciting time for my parents and their peers. They were on full maintenance grants of £300 a year. So my parents were richer than they'd ever been. They paid a flat £3.10 shillings for their approved lodgings, bed and breakfast, full board on Sundays, and they could get very cheap meals in the refectory. They basically spent their waking hours on campus because it was quite a long bus ride from Morecambe. They would stay there late in the evening, often in the Shakespeare pub, which I think it was just next to the main building. I think it's still there. I don't mean to suggest that this was some kind of golden age. The expansion of universities in the early 60s was very modest. Most people still couldn't go to university. Lancaster had more relaxed entry requirements, but it still had mostly middle-class intake, like all the other universities. The teaching was, according to both my parents, a little bit uneven. The pedagogic philosophy was what they used to call FOFO, which means F off and find it out for yourself, which I don't think is a terrible philosophy, actually. But it suited my dad. My dad was thrilled at what he was being asked to do, which is what he did in Smethwick Library, which is take away long reading lists and disappear to the library, which is in the basement of the main building. And once he became so absorbed in his reading that he got locked in overnight. So, getting into Lancaster was the transformative moment of my parents' lives. They met and married each other, so I guess I wouldn't be standing here now if it wasn't for Lancaster. Many people at the time, though, thought that people like my parents shouldn't be going to university at all. In a famous article in Encounter in 1960, the novelist Kingsley Amos attacked what he called the university numbers racket. The fallacy that there are thousands of young people about who are capable of benefiting from university training, but have somehow failed to find their way there. On the planned expansion of universities, he warned in emphatic block capitals, more will mean worse. Amos's article relied on two key assumptions that have proved remarkably persistent in public commentary on universities in the more than 60 years since then. The first is that academic ability is rare and finite. Unlike cars or tins of salmon, students could not be increased at will in a productivity drive. They were like poems or bottles of hock. You cannot decide to have more good ones. Second, students needed to arrive at university with sufficient knowledge for meaningful learning to begin. In the past, his students could have been expected to discuss the niceties of Pope's use of the caesura. Now he was having to spend time on the niceties of who Pope was. For Amos, students who start a university English course knowing nothing about Pope shouldn't be there. So when I hear university lecturers today moaning about what students don't know, or that they can't write, I do understand their exasperation sometimes when I'm marking essays, but I often have to suppress the urge to tell them that people have been moaning about these things for a very long time. And it seems unlikely that they've all been right for the last 60 years. In his memoirs, Amos wrote that even when he started teaching at Swansea University, there were quite enough there in the university who should not have been there. That was in 1949, when 3.4% of young people, most of them men, went to university. Amos's examples came from his own subject, but his broader aim was to defend the humanities against some future university that was geared towards the sciences, by command of what he called the quantitative thinkers who feared that Britain was falling behind America and Russia and needed to catch up. And that is another idea that was starting to be voiced then that has been very persistent, that Britain is in a skills race with other countries, and the main job of universities is to stop us falling behind. At Lancaster, my mum studied English, and my dad studied politics and economics. Now, what's not widely known is that before the 1960s, British universities had a bias towards the sciences, particularly beyond Oxbridge. From the early 60s onwards, that started to change. The share of humanities and social science students began to rise. So my parents were typical in that drift away from the sciences. That was partly because the 1962 Education Act had required local authorities to pay tuition fees and maintenance grants. And that support broadened young people's options. Working class students in particular no longer needed to train as teachers to study the humanities. In particular, women who would have gone to teacher training colleges because tuition fees there were less than half what they were at universities. Now they could go to university and study subjects like English. the government started to worry about this, that not enough students were studying the sciences, and they've continued to worry about it ever since. So, two things were happening. Powerful and vocal groups were lobbying against mass higher education, saying that too many people were going to university. And also, governments were trying to redirect universities' priorities away from the arts and humanities to science, technology, and vocational subjects. At first, those two critiques were separate. Opponents of university expansion, like Kingsley Amos, wanted to preserve the humanities against the dominance of the sciences. But from the late 60s onwards, the critiques began to align. So opponents of expansion began to focus on the over-provision of arts and humanities subjects, particularly at less prestigious institutions. And that shift was something that happened to Amos. So you can see, as the 60s go on, he's still complaining about declining standards. In a letter to the Observer in 1965, he criticised an article about university dropouts for ignoring the almost invariable cause of failure, insufficient ability, or alternatively, excessive stupidity. In a Daily Telegraph article from 1967, Why Lucky Jim Turned Right, he argued that the six were preventing the more intelligent students from learning. But as you can tell from the title of that article, his emphasis was also shifting away from fear of the domination of the sciences to the ideological axe grinding of the arts and social sciences, what some people today would call wokeness. He explained in that article how his disdain for left-wing thought on a subject that on which he had some expertise, which was university expansion, had spread to a disdain for left-wing thought in general, from the Chelsea poems attacking South African apartheid to the first twangings of the protest song industry. And it's significant that the first student sit-in had been staged at the LSE 3 months earlier. And the late 60s and early 70s were the great age of student sit-ins and demonstrations. The revolting students tended to be arts and social science students. Science students rarely got involved. And Amos was not alone in seeing new, voguish university courses as breeding grounds for subversion and proof of the folly of expansion. I'll just have a drink. In 1968, his friend, Philip Larkin, now the University of Hull librarian, wrote to the novelist Barbara Pym, "The universities had expanded suicidally," he told her, "and must now be changed to fit the kind of people we took in. Exams made easier, place made like a factory." It may sound snobbish, he wrote to her again in 1973, but I do think that now we are educating the children of the striking classes. When people preface something with, "it may sound snobbish," it always is snobbish. Both Larkin and Amos contributed to Brian Cox and Tony Dyson's Black Papers on Education, the first of which was published in 1969. Over the next few years, those black papers anticipated much of the educational policy agenda of the next half-century. In the first black paper, Amos blamed the recent spate of student sit-ins on an academically unfit majority who were painfully bewildered by the whole business and purpose of university life. More has meant worse. So the Black Papers were conceived as a response to the student sit-ins, but their remit expanded to include the general perils of progressive education, the shift to comprehensive schools, the end of the 11 plus. Many of the Black Paper contributors were grammar school boys who had done well through that system and looked at it nostalgically. And also experimental courses at the new universities. The Black Papers were sceptical about increased pass rates at O and A level, which is a complaint that has since become a ritual of the results season. They linked grade inflation to the growing preference for coursework over exams, which is another perennially favourite theme. And the Black Papers were very influential. Since, say, the late 1980s, the entire educational system in this country has been transformed by a Black Paperish ethos of meritocratic elitism. And at its heart lies the ideal of social mobility, a very particular idea of social mobility, which is that the most able of the poorer students should be able to move up the educational ladder to the elite universities, what newspapers now routinely call the good universities. At the Labour Party conference in 1999, Tony Blair announced his now famous ambition for 50% of young people to enter higher education. What is less remembered is that that participation was always intended to be very heavily hierarchized. This is a quote from Blair's autobiography, and he's talking here about when he went back on the Labour manifesto's promise not to raise tuition fees in the early 2000s after lobbying from the elite institutions. America's domination in the university league tables was plainly and inescapably due to their system of fees. We'd also got ourselves into a typical egalitarian muddle over the universities that were lower ranked. The previous Tory government had converted the so-called polytechnics into universities, which was fine, except that it fueled the myth that all universities were of the same academic standing, which manifestly they weren't. You might remember as well, around this time, in I think 2000, the Chancellor Gordon Brown criticised Magdalen College, Oxford, for rejecting a candidate, Laura Spence, from a comprehensive school. And there were a number of university admissions controversies around that time, but they focused exclusively on state school pupils who didn't get into Oxbridge. They didn't really focus on any of the other universities. So the point of this very narrowly defined idea of social mobility was that a small number of children from modest, disadvantaged backgrounds or just from state schools would have the same elite education as their more privileged peers. Boris Johnson, then Mayor of London, offered his own distinctive spin on this theme in a lecture in 2013, in which he called for more to be done to help able children from poor backgrounds, because, he said, the harder you shake the pack, the easier it will be for some cornflakes to get to the top. But he added that it is surely relevant to a conversation about equality that as many as 16% of our species have an IQ below 85. Free markets, he said, involve competition between human beings who are already far from equal in raw ability. In his keynote speech to the Tory party conference in 2021, he said this: "We all know that some of the most brilliant and imaginative and creative people in Britain, and some of the best paid people in Britain, did not go to university. People need to be given the options, the skills that are right for them." The point is that, as defined by our political elites, social mobility is not meant to solve social inequality. It's kind of the opposite of solving that. These people do not believe in either the possibility or the desirability of a more equal society. So, what has emerged over the last few decades might be called an elite folk wisdom. And it's based not so much on evidence as on unquestioned assumptions. First, social mobility is seen as an unqualified good. Second, academic ability is seen as a scarce and innate commodity. Opportunities must therefore be carefully rationed according to strict meritocratic principles, with a small number of poorer children being led up to their true place in society. Finally, the market, in the form of competition within and between schools, universities, and also individual students, is what will enforce this supposedly natural hierarchy of winners and losers. And these assumptions have become our new common sense. What's interesting, though, is that the attempt to remake universities along those lines, which, as you can see from the story I've just told, has been going on since my parents were students, that attempt has only been partly successful. British public life is now dominated by rational choice economics, and rational choice economics holds that human choices, human motivations, are driven by the self-interested calibration of personal costs and benefits. What's interesting is that even in the age of £9,000 a year fees, students, and I would probably say generally people, do not always behave or want to behave as opportunity maximizing actors in a market for meritocratic rewards. I think people are just messier than that. They've mostly gone to university, as my parents did, not because they carefully weighed its measurable benefits, but because they had a more general intuition that it would be enjoyable and fruitful. And young people, and to some extent their parents, who are more interested now in their choices because they're making more of a financial contribution, increasingly see higher education as a rite of passage and a right of citizenship. So, this long effort to ration and rigidly hierarchize university admissions has competed with young people's democratic demand for more and better education. As an American politician famously said of democracy, the people have spoken, the bastards. That the market has turned students into consumers, but those pesky kids, as they used to call them on Scooby-Doo, cannot be trusted to consume their education in the appropriate ways, even after years of it being drummed into them. Young people do not necessarily behave or want to behave as the elite folk wisdom would wish them to. The elite folk wisdom has had one big success, which is in increasing the share of students doing science degrees. That share, which, as I said earlier, had been declining since the mid-1960s, has been rising rapidly since 2012. What happened in 2012? That was the year that £9,000 fees came in. And it's been rising at the expense mainly of the arts, languages, the humanities. It's not a drastic decline, but the brunt of that decline has been felt at the less prestigious institutions. And one of the reasons for that is the government ended student number controls in 2013, which has meant there was no limit on recruitment. And the elite universities have made up gaps in humanities admissions by lowering entry tariffs and taking students who might previously have gone elsewhere. So there's been a big rise of humanities enrollments at those universities and a fall elsewhere. And that has been the major factor in the recent wave of redundancies and course closures. Did say I would try not to make it depressing, but that has hit humanities departments in mainly post-92 universities, but also just generally universities outside the elite, including my own. The elite folk wisdom about the humanities is that they should still go on, we should still be allowed to do them, but the proper place to do them is as a minority subject in the elite universities, as a kind of luxury, where of course many of our future leaders, including Boris Johnson, who studied classics, will continue to study them. But young people who don't have a chance of attending those elite institutions should not waste their time on pursuing this humane ideal. They should be steered instead into vocational subjects or apprenticeships or employment. Now, you're not really allowed anymore to say that the wrong sort of people going to university are scum, as the novelist Somerset Maugham famously wrote in his review of Amos's novel, Lucky Jim. Can't really get away with saying that anymore. You can't really get away with saying more will mean worse. The more will mean worse argument has had to be replaced by a more subtle one, which is that a small number of poorer students should receive an elite university education commensurate with their ability. And this argument relies on the elite folk wisdom that academic ability is a fixed and limited entity, and that the job of higher education is to sift and regulate those opportunities accordingly. You may have noticed, if you've been reading newspapers recently, particularly certain kinds of newspapers, that there is a climate of, I would say, low-level, and sometimes not so low-level, hostility to universities in public life. And to some extent, that's been going on for years, as I've demonstrated with some of the quotes that I've given you on earlier slides. But I do think it's certainly ratcheted up very considerably in the last few years. And virtually every news story about universities at the moment has some kind of culture war inflection. But the real story is that this government has signalled that the decades-long expansion of universities is over, particularly in the humanities and particularly in post-92 universities, former polytechnics like my own. I saw a comment piece in the Telegraph recently, last month, saying that it would actually be really good if some universities went bust. The author probably meant universities like mine. And I was staggered, not just at the cruelty of that suggestion, because it would probably mean thousands of people losing their jobs, but at its economic illiteracy, because universities are huge parts of their regional economies. They don't just employ woke humanities lecturers, they employ cleaners, administrators, caterers, builders, and so on. They're like small towns. Why would you want a small town to be destroyed? Why is it okay to say you'd welcome a university going bust when you'd never say that about a school or a hospital or a factory? And it does make me angry, because when people complain that too many people are going to university, they don't mean people from their social class. And they certainly do not mean their own children. One of my former colleagues who took redundancy from the department I teach in said that she thought the way universities are discussed in public life is the last bastion of socially acceptable snobbery. And I think she's right. So, excuse me getting cross, but for me this is a bit personal, not just because I've seen colleagues and friends from my own and other institutions lose their jobs. And I don't think there is really anyone who teaches in an arts subject in a post-1992 university, or even really just one outside the Russell Group, outside the elite institutions, who isn't a bit worried about their future and their job at the moment. But also because my own family history suggests that when very clever, very articulate, very powerful, very confident people, usually men, have said that too many people are going to university, they've usually, no, scrub that, always been wrong. My parents' aspirations to go to university in 1964 were very vague. They were guided by feelings and intuitions. They essentially came to Lancaster on a hunch. The hunch that it would make their lives better. My late father went on to become an academic. My mother, along with many women graduates of her generation, became a teacher. In fact, she's still teaching English to classes of refugees to this country on Zoom. In other words, their hunch was right. And the Kingsley Amoses and Philip Larkins and Professor Brian Cox's, all of them very clever people, were just wrong. And I think one thing that a university education should teach you is the power of groupthink and unexamined assumptions. That being clever often isn't enough. Just because lots of clever people think something and say it with enormous confidence doesn't mean that they're right. Similarly, just because lots of clever people believe in the ethos of meritocratic elitism doesn't mean that they're right either, or it doesn't mean that they're always right. When I think of some of the students I have taught English to at my post-92 university, most of them, like my parents, first-generation students with non-traditional backgrounds, maybe unusual qualifications, who've gone on to be lots of things. Journalists, one of our graduates was Nick Wallace, who was exposed the post office scandal, which I think is something to be proud of. Novelists, actors, teachers, lecturers, just lots of people who went on to live fulfilling, interesting lives and made a difference to themselves and their communities. But I think there's something else, which is the way that universities are talked about in public at the moment is very insulting and patronizing to young people. I think it really infantilizes them. When my parents were at university, the age of majority was still 21. So you were still legally a child. Lancaster University was in loco parentis for most of its students. It was legally responsible for their care because they weren't yet adults. But in fact, for good or ill, they were pretty much allowed to do what they wanted. They were left to their own devices. And a lot of those early students said, we more or less made the university on our own. There was one rule, which is that they had to wear gowns all the time, but everyone just ignored it. Now, of course, students today, the age of majority is 18, so students are now legally adults. But I think they are infantilized far more. Firstly, by a market that treats them as individual, atomized consumers and seeks mainly to address that aspect of their identities. And I once heard an interview with the psychoanalyst and writer Adam Phillips, who said that the problem with capitalism is that it's for children. In other words, it engages with people at the level of appetite and satisfaction. Secondly, I think it infantilizes them by the fear, which is expressed often in newspapers, that students are being indoctrinated by woke ideologies. And honestly, I have enough trouble trying to get them to double-space their essays. I could not indoctrinate them into anything, even if I wanted to. But I think both those ways of thinking about students see them essentially as children who can't think or do things for themselves. And I think back to those first years at Lancaster with its atmosphere of making things up as they went along. Almost by accident, those new universities of the 1960s recreated the medieval idea of the university as a community of scholars. First, because they were so small, so all the students basically knew each other in that first year at Lancaster. And secondly, because eventually, anyway, they were built out of town as self-contained campuses. That was partly by accident. It was just that land prices in the the town centres were too high, so they were built on these greenfield sites, so they were self-contained campuses. Now, university planners have begun to talk recently about what they call the sticky campus, which is one with lots of social spaces so that students stick around before and after class, which is a very admirable aim, but some of us remember the sticky campus as a campus. That's what it was. And the point about a university campus is that it should have that slightly improvised organic quality. You don't always know what will happen when you bring people together. Hopefully something good will happen. And I do think that a university is a way of bringing people together, or it's nothing. And I've started to think, particularly in the post-COVID era, of my own classroom teaching as a kind of corrective to my students' device-driven lives, that they're kind of alone together with the devices in their hands. The good thing about a university class, whether it's a lecture or a seminar, is that it's analog. It's inescapably analog. You have to be there in the room. You have to watch it in real time. You can't scroll forward in times 2 time, which is the famous hack that students have for recorded lectures. It teaches people to be present in a room together, to create this concentrated bubble of shared attention. And I say that often to students. Most of life is just turning up. You've just got to be in the room. My university building, which is a building that used to be a teacher training college, which is where my parents were both accepted to study in Liverpool before they took up their place at Lancaster. And it's very near the 2 Liverpool cathedrals. In fact, I can see the Catholic cathedral from my window. And I've come to think that ideally a university should be like a medieval cathedral. What I mean by that is, in a medieval city, which might only have a population of, say, 10,000, the cathedral could accommodate the whole population of that city at any one time. And a cathedral was not just a place of worship and prayer, it was a place of shelter, sanctuary, conversation, learning. People would eat there, people would socialize there. It was a way of bringing people together. And I think that's what I believe in most of all, is the fact of contiguity, that the power of just being near each other in the same room and making things happen from there. Creative and useful things happen when you just bring people together. And when that's allowed to happen, young people generally have been, in this country, the engines of creativity and growth. Pains me to say that as a middle-aged man. I'd like to think I was still an engine of creativity and growth, but history suggests that it's young people who drive social change, who shape the world in ways that we cannot yet conceive, provided we let them. I saw an interview recently with the actor Peter Capaldi from a working class Glaswegian family, and he went to Glasgow School of Art in the late 70s because, he said, the government paid for him to go and he didn't have to pay them back. He said, "Of course it costs money, but so what? It allowed people from any kind of background to learn about Shakespeare or Vermeer or whatever they wanted to learn about. Why did we lose this belief in ourselves? And that last sentence really struck me. I think the desire to control and channel young people's aspirations to go to university, and also to control what subjects they study there, is about loss of belief and confidence, not just in young people, but also in ourselves. It's fear really, the fear of being left behind by a future that you feel you have no control over. The fear that you will be overtaken in a skills race by more technically minded or economically agile nations. When in fact, the future is still to be decided. That's why it's called the future. The anthropologist Tim Ingold suggests in his recent book, The Rise and Fall of Generation Now, that this elite folk wisdom, that the task of education is to prepare the coming generation for a technocratic world order in which only the smart will survive, sees the future as set in stone, a problem to be solved, rather than something that has not yet happened and that we ourselves create. Now, I'm quite a tired and jaded academic. I'm not actually especially idealistic about universities anymore. They are very imperfect institutions. They're full of power games, invidious distinctions, and irritating people like every other large institution. But I still haven't quite given up on them as a way just of bringing people together unpredictably in that spirit of anticipation that my parents must have had when they alighted from the train at Morecambe Promenade railway station on that balmy Tuesday evening, 6th of October 1964, with the hope, the hunch, that in spite of all these very clever men telling them that they were the more that would mean worse, they'd been given the chance to decide their own future. Thank you for listening.